Um, I think I noticed in the concluding notes from the European Council meeting that actually the only reference to Brexit at all is a one-liner which says the UK Prime Minister informed the European Council about the outcome of the referendum in the UK. Now, I'd say there was a hell of a lot more talking done about it than that, mind you, but it sort of gives you maybe a bit of a glimpse behind the scenes. I mean, there's no doubt about it, but the Brexit referendum, born originally out of David Cameron's arrogance and obviously stirred up a fair bit by the lies of Nigel Farage and racism and so on, at the same time has actually delivered an almighty kick to the European establishment. And I think it would be completely wrong to categorise all of the votes as these sort of jumped up little Englanders who just want to keep immigrants out. I think the truth and the depth of the multi-layers in the vote in that referendum also have their roots in the desire to see a change away from austerity policies, neoliberalism, and indeed the deepening militarisation of the EU, which is a huge cause of the crisis that is being faced. And while there are clearly complexities in the situation for everybody, I think it would be wrong not to acknowledge that actually the vote in a certain way does give an opportunity to people who have looked in dismay at the direction in which the European Union has gone, how it has departed from what many people believed were its original ideals of cooperation and harmony, but in actual fact it has revealed its true nature, which was always been as an institution to promote big business rather than the interests of the citizen. And out of that, I suppose, common pan-European concern at how the hierarchy is going on, there is nuggets as to how we can unite with our fellow Europeans to try and develop a better Europe. Now, apart from the points about TTIP and militarism, which Deputy Pringle has referred to, I think obviously, and the unspoken Brexit, the issue of migration and refugees was the key topic and the biggest challenge facing the European Union. And yet again, I have to say that the response of the Council meeting seems calculated to make the situation worse rather than better, because the focus again is entirely on border control as the answer. But we should know by now that that's the policy that has been in place up to now, and it hasn't worked. If you want to stop the tide of refugees, stop interfering in their countries, stop the drive towards militarisation in an Irish context, stop facilitating the US military through the use of Shannon and so on, because border controls certainly don't work. Now, I've mentioned before the whole area of humanitarian visas, but I do want to hammer home that point because I simply cannot understand why this approach isn't being used to deal with the situation now. A system of humanitarian visas would allow refugees to get to Europe safely, legally and cheaply using regular planes and boats. They could apply for visas via consulates in their own countries or in third countries. They wouldn't have to crowd into dinghies. They wouldn't have to drown. They wouldn't have to give over their life savings to take their lives and chances in the hands of smugglers. But we choose not to allow that happen. And I find that quite incredible. Now, it is true that Europe already has a humanitarian visa system of sorts, but the visas are issued at the discretion of individual states. There's no EU-wide scheme for issuing these visas. And I'd like to know what you and the Taoiseach have done to promote that idea, Minister, because I think it's an incredibly sickening irony in the fact that since the war in Syria has broken out, that the number of humanitarian visas issued by all of the Schengen member states has actually fallen during that period dramatically rather than rising, which is what you would think would happen in response to a humanitarian crisis. And we could have a role to play in this. I think given that we're not part of the Schengen area, we would have considerable scope to be more generous actually in our humanitarian visa systems without even having to get the agreement of all of the EU member states. And I think there's no point in whinging about smugglers when in actual fact our inaction is a key reason why the smugglers are thriving. I mean, smuggling is big business. In Turkey alone, in a year, last year, a crude estimate would put the smugglers' revenues at about 800 million euros. Now, to put that in context, the entire EU Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund for 7 years is just over 3 billion. So the 800 million that's sweated from the life savings of refugees, of their families left behind, is going in to enrich an industry. And what's the European Union's response? Well, we hear you've declared war on the smugglers. Yeah, well, that's really going well, isn't it? It's kind of just about as successful as the war on drugs, because really what we're doing is we're turning human beings into contraband. We first of all bomb their homes, or we help to bomb their homes, and then when they flee, we try to treat them like a sort of an illegal shipment of drugs or cigarettes seized at Dublin Airport. They're grabbed by customs, photographed and slung into a lockup. And it really isn't good enough. You know, when I read about the conclusions of the European Council meeting, which talks about the need to provide continued support to Western Balkan countries in their fight against smugglers and to remain vigilant about the potential developments regarding other routes so as to be able to take rapid and concentrated action, it seems to me that the European Union has most undoubtedly lost its way and has lost its humanity in dealing with this situation. And I want to look at the experience of a surgeon, David Knott, who spent a lot of his time in Syria setting up a network of secret hospitals as a result of the bombing of hospitals that were taking place in that area. And according to him, I'm going to read, just to conclude, Chair, Knott's description of the aftermath of a barrel bomb attack in Syria. Now, as you listen to this, remember that the money being given to Frontex, the EU's border security agency, has increased every year since the outbreak of war in Syria. Remember that research and development funds to the tune of 230 million across 39 programmes have been dedicated to EU research to keep refugees out. A lot of this money going to companies like Airbus, BAE and so on, who all work on the European Security Research Working Group. These are the manufacturers whose bombs in the first place have driven these people out of their home. It's a kind of a win-win on the double. Go in, get the money for bombing them, and then go in and get the money for having the security to keep them out later on. And he talks about one instance where he says, when barrel bombs fall on homes, they often send entire families to the ward. One day, 5 siblings arrived. Unable to treat any of them, he started filming the scene so that he'd have proof of what went on. A baby with no feet let out a stifled cry, then died. An older brother lay silently by, his guts coming out. In the next room, a toddler with blood on his face shouted the name of his dying brother. 2 medical workers carried in the 4th brother, who was 3 years old. His pelvis was missing. His face and chest were grey with concrete dust. His eyes opened, he looked around the room without making a noise. There were wet blobs on his face, and Knott wiped them away. When the sister was brought into the room, he learned that the concrete block had fallen on her head, and the blobs were pieces of her brain. The boy was dying. There was no treatment. He'd lost too much blood. Knott held his hands. All you can do is comfort them, he said. When I asked him what that meant, as the hospital had exhausted its supply of morphine, he began to cry, and he said, all you can do is hope that they die quickly. This is what the people are running from in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Eritrea and Iraq, and we put the borders up. It's absolutely disgusting.
Thank you, Deputy.